Hey guys, tonight we will be stepping back nearly 500 years, returning to an era where cruelty was openly displayed. What if I told you that the most terrifying figure in Tudor England, under the reign of Henry VIII, the man who beheaded 2 queens and burned countless others, was not a soldier, a rebel, or even a deposed queen, but just a young woman, 25 years old, sitting immobile in a chained chair. This is the story of Askew. The cruelty of Henry's reign is undeniable, but no one caused the king such extreme fear and hatred as this educated noblewoman. The king's council tortured her in the Tower of London until her bones were shattered, leaving her unable to stand on her own. Finally, they tied her to a chair in Smithfield Square and set it on fire. But the thing that truly created eternal horror was not the fire itself. As the noxious smoke billowed and the flames began to catch, she did not scream. She preached. Her voice, filled with conviction, rose above the crackling wood, cutting through the weeping crowd, and causing even her executioners to tremble. They wanted silence to extinguish hope. Instead, they created a fire of memory. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are and what your local time is in the comments section. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The morning at Smithfield began in a grey half-light, the kind of soft mist that blurs edges and slows the world down. Yet the square was already full, pressed tight with bodies and breaths and murmurs. Londoners in the time of the Tudors were no strangers to executions. They had watched heads fall and bodies swing often enough. But this morning, the silence felt heavier, as if even the air knew something was different. In the centre of the square there was no familiar gallows, no clean wooden scaffold for a swift stroke of the axe. Instead, there stood a single, solid chair of rough timber, its legs and back bound round with iron chains. People craned their necks, whispering to one another, asking what kind of criminal could not even stand to meet their punishment. The answer came slowly, forcing its way through the packed crowd in the shape of a small procession. Soldiers moved first, elbows and pikes pushing men aside, clearing a path. Behind them came a litter, carried carefully, almost awkwardly, as if the weight upon it were fragile, breakable. On that stretcher lay a woman's body, thin and pale, the limbs lying strangely still, as if they did not quite belong to her. Her face, though, was unnervingly calm, the features composed in a way that made some look down and others stare harder. This was Anne Askew, only 25 years old, a gentlewoman of good family and real learning, already marked by the King's Council as one of the most dangerous women in England. Her danger did not come from steel or from armies, but from words. In the Tower of London, they had tried to break those words out of her. They had stretched her on the rack until her joints slipped and her sinews tore, until walking was no longer possible, and even the smallest movement burned through her body like fire. It was because of that, because she could no longer stand upright at a stake like other condemned prisoners, that she was to be bound into the chair and given to the flames. For women, burning was the chosen punishment, meant not only to kill but to erase, to leave no body, no grave, no trace. Above all this, like a weight pressing down on every decision, was the figure of Henry VIII. It was July, in the year 1546, and the king was in the last swollen, suspicious months of his life. He had broken from the Bishop of Rome, but he had kept most of the old Catholic beliefs and ceremonies. In his England, deviation from that uneasy middle path was dangerous. Anne believed what many reformers on the continent taught, that the bread and wine in the Mass were holy symbols, but not changed into the literal body and blood of Christ. It was a quiet, theological conviction, but in Henry's realm it became a direct challenge to the king's will. Soldiers lifted Anne from the litter and settled her into the waiting chair, tying her carefully, almost clinically, with the cold coils of iron. Wood was piled at her feet and around her skirt, armful after armful, the crack of dry branches sharp in the stillness. Each thud sounded like a warning, like a door closing. Torches were brought forward, their small orange tongues already eager, and when they touched the kindling the fire caught quickly, running from twig to twig, board to board, until threads of smoke began to curl into the warm summer air. Even those standing at the back of the square felt the heat reach them, a slow, widening breath of fire against their faces. Children coughed as the smoke thickened. Some mothers turned their heads away, pressing cloth to their noses, unable to watch, yet unable to leave. Men, hardened by years of public punishments, found their throats tighter than they expected. The sight of the chair, of the broken woman bound to it, made this spectacle different from a clean beheading or a hanging at Tyburn. It felt less like justice, more like something raw and uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing not only the death of a body, but an attempt to silence a soul. Then the flames reached her skirts, licking up the cloth, turning fabric to black and then to ember. This was the moment when most people screamed, when terror and pain broke through any restraint. But the horror of that morning lay in the fact that Anne did not. She did not cry for mercy. She did not curse the king or the church or the men who had put her there. Instead, over the crackle of burning wood, another sound rose, the steady cadence of scripture. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, each word shaped with a strange, quiet certainty. She recited passages she had read and lived with for years, psalms and promises, lines about salvation and steadfastness. The fire roared and snapped, but her sentences wove through it, thin yet unbroken. Some in the crowd began to weep openly, not only for the pain she must be feeling, but for the calm with which she met it. Others, those more closely tied to the old ways, felt a different kind of trembling, a sense that this was not how a condemned heretic was supposed to die. The flames climbed higher, swallowing cloth, then hair, then the frail outline of her form. Smoke rolled across the square, sour and thick, making strong men swallow hard, stomachs churning. Yet the memory that would cling to those present was not the smell, nor even the sight of the fire itself, but the way her voice went on until, at last, the heat stole her breath, and the words dissolved into the dark. This death had been planned as a lesson, a burning warning meant to crush the courage of anyone who might share her beliefs. It was intended to wrap the city in fear and draw a hard line around the king's fragile religious settlement. Instead, on that mist-soft morning at Smithfield, as the crowd slowly drifted away, people carried home something very different. The image of a young woman, bones shattered, body chained, meeting the flames without a scream. A death that should have ended a story had, quietly, become the first glowing edge of a legend. The years before Anne Askew became a name whispered in fear around the royal court were quieter, softer, almost ordinary, at least on the surface. She had been born into comfort, into the rolling fields of Lincolnshire, into a family of standing. Her father, William Askew, was a landowner with influence, the sort of man whose name opened doors and placed his children near the orbit of gentlefolk. In another life, Anne might have grown into the expected shape of a Tudor gentlewoman, obedient, composed, a keeper of a household. But from the beginning, something in her path bent in a different direction. Books were the first turning. Most women of her world were taught to sew, to manage servants, to remain silent. Reading was not considered necessary for them, and reading scripture was considered downright dangerous. But Anne was taught her letters, and once she held a book, she did not set it down again. In that quiet, candlelit discipline eyes tracing the lines of English text, her fate began to take shape long before the tower's rack ever touched her body. She grew up during the greatest religious upheaval England had seen in centuries. When she was a child, Catherine of Aragon was still queen, England still obedient to the Bishop of Rome, and the country's spiritual life still threaded with Latin chants and rituals unchanged for generations. Yet by the year 1534, Henry VIII had severed his kingdom from Rome, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a political break, not a spiritual one. He rejected papal authority but clung to Catholic doctrine, resisting the rising tide of Protestant thought that was sweeping through Germany and Switzerland. And still, the wind carried new ideas across the sea. English translations of the Bible texts forbidden for centuries were smuggled into the country, tucked into the packs of merchants or hidden in bundles of cloth. It was these English words, lucid and direct, that found their way into Anne's hands. Once she began reading them, the world around her seemed to crack open. Scripture, in her eyes, was not something to be handled only by priests. It was alive. It spoke to anyone who dared listen. But in Tudor England, a woman reading scripture for herself, interpreting it openly, was not displaying curiosity. She was stepping across a boundary drawn by kings and bishops. She was trespassing into a realm reserved for learned men. And she was doing it without fear. Anne did not remain silent about what she discovered. She questioned rituals, challenged priests, and spoke of doctrine with a clarity that startled those who heard her. What began as murmured observations soon deepened into firm assertions. Her voice grew steadier. The men who debated her found themselves pressed against the very words they had claimed to guard. A woman, young, educated, and unafraid, had begun to inhabit a space they believed belonged only to them. Her father saw the danger long before the court did. In a world where reputation was as fragile as glass, a daughter who spoke too boldly could tarnish an entire family. And so he attempted the ordinary remedy of the age: marriage. Anne was pushed into union with Thomas Kyme, a man loyal to traditional Catholic belief, a man who expected obedience and silence. Marriage, he believed, would settle her, anchor her, tame her. But Anne was not made of material that bent easily. She refused to abandon the faith she had embraced. She refused to act as the dutiful wife who folded her beliefs behind her husband's expectations. The marriage crumbled quickly, becoming less a union than a battleground. To leave one's husband in Tudor England was nearly unthinkable for a woman of her rank. Yet Anne did exactly that. She walked away, not through the narrow legal channels of annulment, but by reclaiming her maiden name and her independence. It was an act of rebellion that rippled far beyond her quiet Lincolnshire world, and rebellion rarely stays small. The further Anne stepped from the prescribed shape of a Tudor woman, the more she was drawn into circles of people who, like her, were restless beneath the old religious order. Secret gatherings, whispered conversations, pages of scripture passed hand to hand. These were the places where her voice grew brighter, sharper. While others trembled at the thought of questioning church doctrine, Anne asked the questions aloud. The dangerous ones. The ones even scholars hesitated to answer. In those dimly lit rooms, she became something unexpected. A woman whose words carried weight, whose certainty unsettled men of learning, and whose courage, soft but unyielding, began to attract attention. Attention first from friends, then from strangers, and finally from those who governed a kingdom where faith was no longer simply faith, but treason wrapped in theology. It was in those quiet meetings, long before the flames at Smithfield, that the path toward her fate was already being carved in shadow and silence. By the time Anne Askew reached London, she was no longer the quiet young woman who had first opened an English Bible in Lincolnshire. In the capital, her voice sharpened, her mind steadied, and her resolve hardened into something unmistakably dangerous. She debated openly with learned men, priests, scholars, theologians standing in public spaces where only male voices were expected to echo. She questioned the nature of the Mass, challenged the doctrine of transubstantiation, and refused to bow before rituals she believed contradicted Scripture. For conservative ears, these statements were blasphemy. But for reformers, Anne became a rare and brilliant light. And more unsettling than her ideas was this simple truth. People listened to her. London at the time was a tense battleground of belief. Henry VIII, in the year 1546, was desperately trying to hold together a religious compromise that satisfied no one. He had broken from Rome but kept Catholic ceremonies. He permitted some English scripture but punished those who embraced Protestant theology too boldly. His entire authority rested on this fragile middle ground, and anyone who disrupted that balance threatened not only doctrine, but the stability of the crown itself. Anne disrupted it with every word she spoke. She did not speak as a frightened woman, whispering in corners. She spoke with clarity, certainty, and a kind of soft courage that spread through people like a quiet fire. Even members of the court ladies who served the Queen, gentlemen who attended the King, began repeating her arguments behind closed doors. In the Tudor court, where a stray sentence could send a person to the scaffold, that was a sign of astonishing influence. Anne also wrote. Her writings were not disorganized outbursts, but measured, thoughtful pieces, poems, theological reflections, and accounts of her interrogations, all threaded with scripture. Her words were sharp enough that even seasoned examiners found themselves momentarily silenced. In a world where women did not publish, her manuscripts moved in secret, copied by sympathetic hands and carried across England like illicit lanterns glowing in the dark. But what truly terrified those in power was not the theology she professed. It was where she stood dangerously close to the women of the royal household. And at the centre of that circle was Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife. Catherine was learned, thoughtful, and known to lean toward reform. She owned English books of devotion. She encouraged the education of women. And she had, at times, debated theology with the king himself, something only possible because she did it gently, cloaked in the language of obedience. If Anne Askew could be tied officially, visibly to the Queen's circle, the consequences would be catastrophic. Conservative Catholics at court, already seeking ways to weaken Catherine Parr, saw an opportunity shimmering before them. Anne was no longer merely a heretic. She was a potential key one that could unlock the door to the Queen's downfall. A Protestant woman was already dangerous. A Protestant woman who might endanger the Queen was something else entirely. Such a woman, in the eyes of those who feared reform, had to be destroyed completely. And so the machinery of power began to turn. Anne's name appeared in whispered discussions among councillors. Men whose decisions determined the fate of the kingdom began referring to her not as an individual, but as a threat. Orders were drafted, quietly at first, then with sharpened urgency. Her movements were watched, her conversations noted, and finally, the decision was made. She must be arrested again. But this time, the purpose was different. They did not want apologetic words. They did not want her to recant. They wanted names. Names of those who listened to her. Names of those who supported reform. And above all, the name of the Queen. Anne could not have known, as the knock came at her door, that she was walking not only into a prison, but into the heart of a political storm far larger than herself. She could not have known how deeply her silence would terrify the men who interrogated her, or how fiercely they would try to break that silence apart. She went to the Tower of London, believing she would be questioned. She did not yet know that the full weight of the realm's cruelty was about to be placed upon her shoulders. What awaited her in the tower was more than questioning. It was the cold frame of the rack, prepared for her small body. It was pain beyond the limits of bone and sinew. It was the demand that she betray those who trusted her. And it was, quietly and unexpectedly, the beginning of the fear that would shake the Tudor court to its core, not fear of what Anne would say, but fear of what she would refuse to say. They brought her through the stone passageways of the Tower of London, on a day when the light itself seemed thin, as if even the sun hesitated to accompany her. Anne Askew had been questioned before, held briefly, examined, released with warnings, but as the heavy doors closed behind her this time, she understood with a quiet certainty that the path ahead would not resemble any she had walked before. The air inside the tower felt different, colder, heavier, threaded with purpose. And waiting within that darkness were two men whose names alone could chill the blood of even the boldest prisoners. Thomas Wriothesley, Lord Chancellor, and Sir Richard Rich, one of the king's most ruthless counsellors, did not merely sign orders or watch from afar. They stood present, directing her interrogation themselves. In all of Tudor England, there were no figures more feared by those accused of heresy or treason. Their involvement signalled something extraordinary, something ominous. For a gentlewoman like Anne to face their personal scrutiny was already a break from custom. For them to supervise her torture was an alarm bell ringing across the realm. They wanted names. Not prayers, not apologies. Names. They wanted proof. Any proof that Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife, harboured Protestant sympathies dangerous enough to justify her downfall. They demanded Anne reveal the ladies who met in private, the courtiers who whispered reform, the noble women who read English devotionals. Each question was a thread they hoped to tug until the entire fabric of the Queen's household unravelled. Anne refused, so they made their next move. In a chamber meant to break men, they brought forward the rack, that infamous wooden frame of pulleys and ropes, a device that had already torn apart bodies far stronger than hers. Torture of this kind was not only brutal, it was unlawful for gentlewomen. And yet, on that day, the law bent beneath the weight of fear and ambition. She was the only documented gentlewoman in Tudor England ever tortured on the rack. They laid her down, binding her wrists and ankles with coarse ropes, each knot tied by hands familiar with the art of destruction. Wriothesley and Rich stood close enough to see every tremor of her face, every breath she tried to steady. When they asked again for names, and she remained still, the order was given. The wheel turned. The first pull stretched her arms until the joints groaned. The second forced her shoulders from their sockets. By the third, the delicate balance of bone and sinew began to tear. Pain flooded her, not a sharp stab, but a consuming blaze, as if her body were being pulled out of itself. 3 strong men strained the ropes, each rotation designed to extract more than breath, more than confession. It was meant to take the will, to crush the self. She was the only documented gentlewoman in Tudor England ever tortured on the rack. They laid her down, binding her wrists and ankles with coarse ropes, each knot tied by hands familiar with the art of destruction. Wriothesley and Rich stood close enough to see every tremor of her face, every breath she tried to steady. When they asked again for names, and she remained still, the order was given. The wheel turned. The first pull stretched her arms until the joints groaned. Hours dragged by, marked only by the creaking wood and the sound of their own frustration. Her limbs stretched beyond their natural limits. Her muscles tore. Her joints slipped loose, leaving her body twisted and ruined. At last they stopped, not out of mercy, but because there was nothing left to pull. Anne Askew was lifted from the rack, a shattered shape, arms dangling uselessly, legs unable to bear weight, back and shoulders permanently deformed. They carried her to her cell, like a broken doll, limbs limp, breath shallow. She would never walk again. She would never stand again. From that day forward, she belonged to the chair in which she would later burn. But even in ruin, she had denied them what they wanted most. Her silence had wrapped itself around the names of women in the court, protecting them, shielding them, perhaps saving their lives. It protected scholars who corresponded in secret, nobles who read banned books, and even the Queen herself during the storm that threatened her position. Anne Askew, only 25 years old, had endured what no gentlewoman before her had endured. And in the quiet aftermath, broken bones, torn flesh, breath trembling through pain, she had done something more powerful than speaking. She had refused, and that refusal echoed louder than any confession ever could. Her body was destroyed, but her silence lived, travelling through the corridors of Whitehall, unsettling those who had ordered her torment, whispering into the minds of the powerful that some truths cannot be forced from a soul, no matter how brutally the body is broken. It was the first moment when the Tudor court realized they had tortured her body, but they had not touched her will. That summer, when the Tower's torture chamber failed to break Anne Askew, the conservative faction around the dying king understood that they had reached the end of their methods. If pain could not force her to betray the Queen, then her death would have to serve a different purpose. And so they reached for the punishment reserved for women convicted of heresy or treason: burning, a sentence designed not only to kill, but to erase, leaving no body, no grave, no physical memory behind. In the capital, her voice sharpened, her mind steadied, and her resolve hardened into something unmistakably dangerous. She debated openly with learned men, priests, scholars, theologians, standing in public spaces where only male voices were expected to echo. She questioned the nature of the Mass, challenged the doctrine of transubstantiation, and refused to bow before rituals she believed contradicted Scripture. For conservative ears, these statements were blasphemy, a throne of punishment for a woman who no longer had use of her legs. They would burn her sitting down, publicly, visibly, so that London could witness both her destruction and her helplessness. Word of this spread swiftly through the city. Executions were common in Tudor London, but this was different. A gentlewoman, crippled by state torture, to be burned in a chair? Crowds gathered long before dawn, whispering with a mixture of dread, curiosity, and unease. Even those who disliked the rising Protestant ideals felt something twist in their stomachs. If her beliefs were so dangerous, why did they need to break her body first? Why was a woman so small, so wounded, treated like an enemy capable of toppling the realm? As the soldiers carried Anne into Smithfield, the murmurs died. The sound of chains brushing against wood echoed faintly. Nothing else. Even members of the court ladies who served the Queen, gentlemen who attended the king, began repeating her arguments behind closed doors. In the Tudor court, where a stray sentence could send a person to the scaffold, that was a sign of astonishing influence. Anne also wrote. Her writings were not disorganized outbursts, but measured, thoughtful pieces, poems, theological reflections, and accounts of her interrogations, all threaded with Scripture. Instead, they saw a girl whose youth was still visible under the bruises, whose expression held no terror, only a calm that felt otherworldly. The soldiers set her chair in the center of the square, fastening chains around her waist and across her chest so she would not slump forward when the flames rose. Around her feet, they heaped bundles of dry wood brush, faggots, straw, until the shape of her fragile body disappeared behind a wall of kindling. For a long moment, the square held its breath. There was no shouting, no jeering, only the dull, rhythmic thump of wood landing against more wood. Then the fire was lit. The first tongues of flame licked the edges of the piled sticks, curling upward with hungry crackles. Smoke drifted toward the sky, thick and bitter, catching in the throats of the spectators. Mothers pressed hands over their children's eyes. Men who had witnessed dozens of deaths felt their stomachs tighten. The heat grew quickly, swelling outward in waves, until even those standing far back felt it brush their faces like a warning. And then something happened, something that should not have happened, something that made the moment unforgettable. Anne began to speak, not a scream, not a plea, but scripture. Her voice rose thinly at first, almost too fragile to carry through the smoke. Then, as if drawn from a depth untouched by the rack's cruelty, it steadied. The crowd parted silently, and in that parting stood a young woman whose body seemed barely able to hold breath, yet whose face, pale and thinned by suffering, remained unsettlingly serene. She did not glare. She did not weep. She simply was, and that quiet presence unnerved more people than any loud declaration could have. Some had expected a monster, a zealot foaming with madness. The flames rose higher, swallowing the hem of her gown, then the outlines of her arms, then the rest of her. Her voice grew fainter, thinner, until finally the fire reached the breath inside her lungs and the scripture dissolved into ash. But the silence that followed was not the silence the council had wanted. It was the silence of people witnessing something they would never forget. They had meant to destroy her. They had meant to erase her. They had meant to make her a warning. Instead, they made her a memory that would not die, a young woman bound to a chair, preaching into the fire until the fire took her breath. And long after the smoke rose from Smithfield that day, England carried her voice with them, soft as ashes yet impossible to scatter. In medieval England, danger did not always come from swords or from the bold defiance of a king's command. Sometimes it was smaller, quieter, printed in black ink on thin paper. Sometimes danger was simply a word written in English. For centuries, the voice of God had been locked behind Latin phrases spoken only by priests, an iron door that ordinary believers were never meant to open. Scripture belonged to the church. Interpretation belonged to the clergy. And to read the Bible in English was to reach for a key that the gatekeepers had hidden for generations. Yet Askew reached for that key, not once, but again and again, until it became the shape of her entire life. Once taught to read, a privilege almost unheard of for Tudor women, Anne did not settle for the modest devotional snippets most expected her to know. She devoured the text. She traced each line with the hunger of someone who felt the words glow beneath the page. Curiosity became fascination. Fascination became study, and study became conviction. And unlike many who tucked their discoveries inside their hearts, Anne spoke. At first quietly innocent questions, gentle musings, but soon the questions sharpened. She asked why rituals were performed. She asked what sacraments truly meant. She asked why the bread and wine could not be understood as symbols rather than literal flesh and blood. For conservative minds, her questions were not only bold, they were improper. A woman was not meant to wield scripture like that, turning it over in her hands as confidently as any scholar. But Anne did. She dissected doctrine, challenged tradition, and held her ground with the calm assurance of someone who believed truth was not the property of the powerful. Her father, William Askew, recognized the danger before it reached the ears of the king. In the 16th century, a daughter's voice could tarnish a family's standing, especially a voice as sharp and unyielding as Anne's, and so he chose the most traditional remedy, a marriage. Anne was given to Thomas Kyme, a loyal Catholic, a man firmly rooted in the old order. In her father's mind, this union was a wall, a boundary, a cage. Marriage, as he understood it, would replace scripture with household duties, contemplation with obedience, a woman's fierce independence with the predictable rhythm of Tudor domestic life. But Anne Askew was never meant to live inside a cage. She did not lay aside the faith she had embraced. She did not feign agreement with her husband's beliefs. She did not shrink to fit the mold expected of her. Conservative Catholics at court, already seeking ways to weaken Catherine Parr, saw an opportunity shimmering before them. Anne was no longer merely a heretic. She was a potential key one that could unlock the door to the Queen's downfall. A Protestant woman was already dangerous. A Protestant woman who might endanger the Queen was something else entirely. Such a woman, in the eyes of those who feared reform, had to be destroyed completely. And so the machinery of power began to turn. A woman who chose herself over her husband was a disruption. A woman who claimed her name back was a threat. A woman who did both without whispering apology was unimaginable. It should have ended her. It should have forced her into hiding. But Anne did not retreat. Instead, she moved deeper into the network of reform-minded believers scattered across London, men and women, who gathered in candlelit rooms, sharing English books and ideas too dangerous to speak in public. And in those gatherings, something remarkable happened. Anne's voice did not fade. It grew. What had once been a solitary woman reading quietly became a woman whose questions guided discussion, whose certainty unsettled priests, whose courage made others straighten their backs. Those who listened to her speak said she possessed a strange steadiness, a gentleness that masked an iron conviction. She asked the questions others were too frightened to utter. She framed doubts that many had buried for fear of the stake. And slowly, the center of those whispered meetings began to shift toward her. Anne Askew was no longer just a young gentlewoman reading scripture in English. She was becoming a force, still soft-spoken, still slender, still young, but luminous in a way that drew attention from both allies and enemies. Her words travelled farther than she knew. Her questions stirred deeper waters than she imagined. And, without understanding it yet, Anne had stepped onto a path where belief would collide with power, and where power, frightened, would eventually strike back with all its force. By the time Anne Askew settled into life in London, she was no longer simply the young woman who loved scripture with a quiet intensity. Each day she stepped further out of the shadowed corners expected of her, and further into the open spaces where only male voices were supposed to speak. The marriage cracked quickly, two opposing worlds tied together by law but divided by conviction. Thomas Kyme demanded silence. Anne answered with steadfastness. He demanded conformity. Anne offered truth as she understood it. And at last the impossible happened. She left him, not through a legal separation, not through formal annulment. She simply walked away and reclaimed her maiden name. In Tudor society, this was nothing less than scandalous. But to the royal court, her voice represented something far more dangerous than simple disagreement. It was rebellion by thought. Henry VIII, by the year 1546, had torn his kingdom from the Bishop of Rome, yet he clung stubbornly to Catholic doctrine. His England was an uneasy compromise, a land where the Pope held no authority, but where most Catholic rituals still defined worship. Those who wished to return to Rome felt betrayed. She debated with learned men, priests trained in Latin, scholars schooled at Cambridge arguing about the nature of the Mass, the meaning of the sacraments, the truth behind the bread and wine. She refused to kneel before rituals she believed contradicted Scripture, and she did so not with fury, but with an unnerving calm. To conservative ears, her words were blasphemy. To reformers, they were a ray of clarity, in a world clouded by fear and confusion. What made her a threat was not her youth, nor her gender, nor her lack of official position. It was the fact that her ideas travelled farther than she ever intended and into rooms she never entered. Her words reached parlours of the nobility, where wives of courtiers repeated her arguments behind closed doors. They found their way into quiet conversations at Whitehall, drifting into the spaces near the king's own chambers. Those who longed for deeper Protestant reform felt suffocated. Between these factions stretched a tense middle ground, maintained only by the force of the king's will. In that fragile space, Anne's voice slipped like a spark in a room filled with dry timber. She did not only speak, she inspired thought. She stirred doubt. She caused people to remember her words and whisper them later in places where whispers were dangerous. In a time when women did not publish, her words travelled in secret, copied by hand, passed between believers, cherished like contraband treasures. Those pages transformed her from a simple suspect into something unprecedented, one of the first Englishwomen to leave behind a personal theological record of her own persecution. But writing was only half the danger. The greater fear lay in where her influence reached. What began as a gentlewoman's reflections became a murmur, threading through the palace, soft but perceptible. And those in power knew that such soft murmurs, if ignored, had toppled kingdoms before. Anne wrote, too, poems, declarations of faith, accounts of her interrogations, all laced with scripture, all unyielding in tone. Her writing was composed, steady, polished with intellect. She had a quiet, careful leaning toward reform, never bold enough to challenge the king outright, but clear enough that enemies of Protestant thought watched her with suspicion. Rumours drifted through the corridors of Whitehall like smoke, that the Queen's devotional ideas resembled Anne's, that she read books Anne approved of, that she sympathised with women like Anne, who reached for scripture without permission. True or not, the rumour alone was enough to electrify the Conservative faction. If Anne Askew could be tied officially, publicly to the Queen's household, if even the faintest connection could be established, it would give Catherine's enemies exactly what they needed, a reason to drag Henry's sixth wife down the same path that had claimed two queens before her. From that moment, Anne was no longer simply a heretic to be silenced. She became a potential weapon, a key, a foothold, a means to reach the Queen. Her existence became political, her faith became ammunition, and her voice, gentle, measured, unwavering, became the sound that Conservative councillors most feared echoing through the palace. A Protestant woman was already perilous. A Protestant woman whose influence touched the Queen was intolerable. And so, the quiet fire she carried inside her, lit long ago by the pages of an English Bible, began to cast shadows across the highest chambers of the Tudor court, shadows that powerful men were determined to extinguish. Once Anne's name drifted too close to the shadow of the Queen, her fate slipped out of her own hands. From that moment on, she was no longer merely a woman with unorthodox beliefs, she was a political opportunity. The Conservative faction at court, determined to pull England back toward the old Catholic order, recognised in her a perfect weapon. If they could make Anne confess that she had taught reformist doctrine to the ladies of the court, especially Queen Catherine Parr, then they would have the justification they needed to destroy the sixth wife of Henry VIII. All they needed was her voice saying the right words. And so they cast their net around her. The arrest came swiftly, coldly, with no room for questions. Anne had been detained before, questioned briefly, then released. But this time there was no gentle pretense. She was taken straight to the Tower of London, the fortress from which countless prisoners had entered, but never returned. This was no longer about inquiry. It was about extraction. They wanted to pry truth or something shaped like truth from her by any means. Inside the tower, the infamous rack was already waiting. It stood in a dim stone chamber. A heavy wooden frame, ropes tied at each corner, a wheel used to tighten the tension until bones tore themselves apart. It had broken soldiers, rebels, spies, men hardened by battle, men prepared to die. But to use it on a woman of Anne's rank, a gentlewoman, was to shatter one of the unwritten rules of English legal custom. Women of status were not subjected to torture. Their examinations, even in cases of treason, were limited to questioning. But in the year 1546, fear outweighed custom, and ambition drowned out law. Her presence on the rack was an outrage even to some of her enemies. They bound her wrists. They tied her ankles. They began to turn the wheel. With each pull, the question returned. Who in the Queen's household shares your beliefs? Did Catherine Parr read the same books? Did she discuss reform with you? Anne is still silent. The ropes tightened. Her shoulders pulled from their sockets. Her elbows strained until the ligaments snapped. The pain was not a single point, it was a spreading tide, crashing through her limbs, tearing the borders of her body apart. Where most would have broken, Anne held to the only anchor left to her, scripture. Verses surfaced in her mind like small islands of clarity. She gripped them with what remained of her strength, letting the cadence of holy words shield her from the chaos of pain. Minutes slipped into hours. The torturers, men who had watched flesh burst and limbs twist, began to falter. It was not pity. It was confusion. She was small, frail. Her body should not have endured even the first turn of the wheel. And yet she did not speak the names they demanded. They pulled harder. She did not yield. They shouted. She did not tremble. They stretched her until the boundaries of her physical form nearly tore apart, and still she offered no betrayal. Only scripture. Only the rhythm of faith spoken from a mind that refused to break even as bone and tendon did. By the time they stopped, her limbs were dislocated, her muscles torn, her body twisted beyond repair. She could not walk. She could not stand. She could barely move at all. The woman they carried back to her cell was no longer physically whole. She would never rise to her feet again. But the question they feared most remained unanswered. From that day onward, Anne existed in the tower not as a prisoner who might be persuaded, but as a body ruined by their hands and a will they could not touch. She could no longer move without assistance, could no longer navigate the world except through the arms of others. And yet for those who cared for her in secret, those who met under candlelight to read forbidden words, Anne's broken form became something else, a living testament. They had attempted to humiliate her. They had hoped to reduce her to pity. They wanted her to collapse beneath the weight of her own suffering. Instead, she transformed the humiliation into a quiet victory. Her silence, unyielding, uncompromising, became a sermon more powerful than any spoken aloud. She had protected every name they sought. She had shielded women who trembled for their own safety. She had refused to sacrifice Catherine Parr to save herself. In the end, the rack had broken her bones, but it had not bent her faith. And that unbroken center made her more dangerous and more unforgettable than any confession ever could. After the failure in the torture chamber, the conservative faction realized quietly, grimly, that rope and iron could not force Anne Askew to bend. And so they turned to the one weapon Tudor England always reserved for women whom the state wished to erase entirely: fire. Men convicted of treason or heresy might face beheading or hanging punishments that left behind a body, a grave, a place where memory could linger. But women were different. The authorities claimed that hanging or beheading a woman was improper, that it violated a certain imagined delicacy. Their solution, however, was anything but delicate. Women were burned, not as an act of mercy, not as a cleaner form of justice, but as a ritual of annihilation. The flames consumed the body until nothing remained but ash, carried away on the wind, leaving no burial, no stone, no relic. It was the state's way of ensuring a woman's existence could not become a rallying point for others. To burn a woman was to attempt to erase her completely. And in the year 1546, as tension between conservative Catholics and reforming Protestants reached its peak, the conservatives believed Anne Askew was the perfect sacrifice for their message. Figures like Bishop Stephen Gardiner, Bishop Edmund Bonner, and the hard-edged councillors Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich saw in Anne's case an opportunity not just to punish heresy, but to terrorize the entire reformist movement. In their minds, if a young gentlewoman could be destroyed publicly, visibly, brutally, then everyone from humble believers to the Queen herself would tremble. And so they built their spectacle. When news of Anne's sentence spread through the city, London stirred like a hive struck by a stone. Executions were common, heads fell on Tower Hill, bodies swung at Tyburn, but this was different. A gentlewoman, barely 25, crippled by state torture, to be burned alive in a chair? Even those who opposed reform felt unease shiver down their spines. Some muttered that this was simply the king's justice. Others whispered carefully, quietly, that this was cruelty wearing the mask of religion. But no one dared to speak too loudly. At Smithfield, preparations were deliberate, theatrical. The wooden chair built because Anne could no longer stand was placed where every eye could see it. Wood was stacked around it in a careful ring, like scenery arranged for a morbid stage play. This was not just an execution. It was a warning the conservative faction hoped would echo across England. Meanwhile, within the palace, Queen Catherine Parr walked a razor's edge of her own. Those who hunted Anne did not forget their true target. Catherine had long been known for her learning, her fluency with scripture, her gentle leanings toward reform. Rumours had been seeded around Henry VIII like poison. Whispers that the Queen entertained dangerous ideas, that she read forbidden books, that she might sympathise with women like Anne. And in the King's final paranoid years, rumour alone could kill. Catherine was questioned, shadowed, pushed toward the same precipice that had claimed queens before her. For a brief, breathless moment, she stood one step from disaster. If she resisted, if she argued, if she showed even a flicker of independence, The path ahead would lead directly to the execution ground. But Catherine Parr did what so many Tudor survivors had done before her. She bowed, outwardly if not inwardly. She told Henry that her discussions were merely attempts to learn from his wisdom, that she had no theological opinion but his own. She soothed his ego. She lived. She escaped the fire by a thread, but someone still had to burn. Anne Askew, crippled, unbroken and already marked for death, became the final vessel for the message the Conservatives wished to send. They could no longer touch the Queen, not yet. Not without proof. But they could still let the flames speak in her place. Anne's execution would be the warning that Catherine had narrowly avoided, a reminder that the Crown's tolerance was paper-thin, and faith could be fatal. Thus the stage was set. The chair, the wood, the crowd, and the young woman whose silence had unsettled the most powerful men in England. In their eyes, the fire would finish what the rack could not. In their eyes, they would burn away a threat. In their eyes, this flame would end her story. But in truth, the fire was about to ensure she would be remembered far longer than any of them. On the morning of the 16th day of July, in the year 1546, Smithfield, so often a place of noise, trading, and the smell of livestock transformed into the stage for a tragedy England would remember for centuries. 4 prisoners were brought out for execution that day, all condemned for their commitment to Protestant reform. Among them were John Lascelles, once a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, Nicholas Bellingham, a priest who had embraced the new doctrine, and John Adams, a humble tailor whose faith had led him to the stake. Yet despite the presence of 3 men, the crowd's eyes fixed unavoidably upon the 4th figure, Anne Askew, 25 years old, bound to a chair because the rack had destroyed her ability to stand. Even before the fire was lit, the sight of her, her thin hands tied against the wood, her shoulders twisted from torture, her face frighteningly calm, cast a silence over the gathered crowd that no spectacle at Smithfield had ever produced. As tradition demanded, the sheriff approached her with one final offer. If she would recant, if she would deny her beliefs, reject her understanding of Scripture, and proclaim obedience to the doctrine upheld by Henry VIII, then she might live. It was the last mercy the world would extend to her. But her answer did not tremble. She told him she believed all the Scriptures to be true. Every word, every verse. No hesitation. No wavering under the weight of imminent death. And for those who watched, it was this calm refusal, not the flames, that struck deepest. The torches touched the kindling. Dry wood crackled, sending sparks up into the heavy summer air. The fire curled around the edges of the faggots, then climbed, brightening from orange to white as it reached the chair. Witnesses later wrote that the pain must have been unimaginable. Flames swallowed her clothing, then reached her skin, then consumed the chair itself. But the memory that haunted everyone who stood in that square was not the violence of the blaze. It was her voice. Anne did not scream. She did not beg. She did not cry out for mercy. Instead, she recited Scripture faintly at first, then with a clarity that seemed impossible for a body already breaking under the heat. Those who stood closest later swore the sound rose above the roaring fire, turning the entire square into something like an unwilling church. Even hardened men felt tears prick their eyes as her words mixed with smoke. The scene, meant to terrify, produced something entirely different. Where the authorities had intended to inspire dread, many found themselves overwhelmed by a quiet, piercing admiration. Where they sought to destroy her influence, they accidentally gave it voice. Not long after Anne's death, John Foxe, in his monumental work Acts and Monuments, a compilation of Protestant martyrdoms, recorded her courage at the stake. He wrote that her steadfastness converted more hearts to reform than all her arguments ever had while she lived. The image of a young gentlewoman, crippled by torture, burning without renouncing her belief, became a symbol that crossed borders. Her written words, her interrogations, her poems, her theological responses were copied, preserved, and carried beyond England's shores. They reached Germany and Switzerland, where the Reformation was gaining strength. They entered the hands of scholars, preachers, and ordinary believers alike. That image, the young woman chained to a chair, swallowed slowly by fire, yet still reciting Scripture, began to live a life of its own. It was told in homes. It was whispered in secret gatherings. It crossed from generation to generation, until it became more than an execution. It became a parable of conviction, Henry VIII's government had meant to silence her with flames. Instead, the flames carried her voice further than she could ever have imagined. Anne Askew, gentlewoman of Lincolnshire, left behind no grave, no monument, not even a handful of ashes. Yet she left behind something the authorities could not erase. A story England would never stop telling. Her death at Smithfield did not end her story. If anything, it was the moment it began to grow quietly at first, like embers glowing beneath ash, then brighter, wider, until the memory of Anne Askew slipped beyond the reach of the men who had ordered her destruction. Even before the ground beneath the stake had cooled, London was already carrying her name through its narrow, cobbled streets. People whispered about the young woman who had sat chained to a chair, body ruined, yet voice unbroken. Market women repeated the tale with trembling hands. Merchants carried it home on horseback as they travelled back to Kent, Essex, or across the sea. And among those who followed the reformist cause, her death felt like a seal, a confirmation that their belief had been tested in flame and had not crumbled. What surprised even the reformers themselves was what happened next. The words Anne had spoken in prison, the brief poems, the fragments of testimony, the bold answers she had offered her interrogators had not died with her. Somehow, through secrecy, courage, and no small risk, those words were written down, copied in the Tower, smuggled out past guards who were supposed to keep them contained. They were passed from hand to trembling hand among London's Protestant circles until they reached men and women capable of spreading them further. And spread they did. Those fragile pages made their way out of England entirely, carried across the Channel to Germany and Switzerland, the beating intellectual hearts of the European Reformation. There, scholars read about Anne, not as a victim, but as a symbol, an emblem of courage, a woman who allowed her body to be broken, but refused to surrender her soul. In the eyes of reformers on the continent, Anne Askew became living proof that Protestant belief had taken root so deeply in England that not even fire could burn it out. If a gentlewoman, barely 25, could face the rack and the stake without renouncing her faith, how could any king hope to reverse the tide? And in that question lay the quiet power of her martyrdom. For in killing her, Henry VIII's regime had not buried her message. It had amplified it. Across England, people who had long feared speaking openly began to find one another. They met in private rooms, behind shuttered windows, in churchyards after dusk. And always someone would mention Smithfield. Someone would recall the girl who was carried because she could no longer walk. Someone would speak of the way she read scripture while her body burned. The authorities had intended the spectacle as a warning. Instead, it became a bond, a shared memory that drew reform, minded believers closer together. Some began to call her England's Jeanne d'Arc, not because she led armies, she never lifted a weapon, but because she fought with something the crown found far harder to defeat: her mind, her conviction, her refusal to be moved. Like Joan, she had defied the structures built to contain her. Like Joan, she had died at the stake. Like Joan, she became more powerful dead than alive. What the Tudor authorities could not understand, what they never even considered, was that they had created a martyr, a woman with no title, no land, no political position, had suddenly become the centre of England's religious struggle. In an age when women were expected to obey, Anne's death became a story that mothers whispered to daughters, that students repeated in secret, that preachers wove into sermons delivered underground. The image was impossible to erase. A wooden chair, flames rising, a broken body, a steady voice reading scripture. The Conservatives had wanted her ashes to scatter on the wind, leaving no trace. But memory is not ash. Memory is spark. The fire they lit to silence her instead rekindled itself in the hearts of those yearning for change. It glowed in hidden gatherings. It glowed in books printed abroad. It glowed even in the uneasy dreams of those in power, who suddenly realized that a dead woman was becoming far louder than a living one. And in time, that glow would spread. When Henry VIII died in the year 1547, England passed into the hands of his only legitimate son, Edward VI, a boy of 9 years old. And with that child king, something extraordinary happened. Something the reformers had prayed for, whispered about, and waited on for years. The religious tide, slow and uncertain under Henry, suddenly surged forward. Under Edward, Protestant scholars stepped into power. Bishops and councillors who had previously stayed quiet now reshaped the realm with an energy England had never seen. Churches removed old ornaments. Latin gave way to English. Ceremonies changed. And slowly, almost breathlessly, the England of Henry VIII began to transform into an England that looked toward Geneva instead of Rome. Many historians believe this transformation had an emotional foundation laid not by kings nor bishops, but by martyrs. And among them, none shone brighter nor more painfully than Anne Askew. Her story had moved through England like a quiet earthquake. The brutality she endured, the way her crippled body was carried to Smithfield, the scripture she read as fire rose around her, it shaped how ordinary people felt about faith. They no longer encountered Protestantism only through sermons or disputations. They experienced it through Anne's suffering. Her death made reform not just an intellectual argument, but a human tragedy, etched into collective memory. By the time Edward took the throne, many saw his reign as a sign, a confirmation that God favoured reform. And when the boy king's counsellors pushed England further toward Protestantism, people whispered that Anne Askew's sacrifice had prepared the nation's heart. They did not simply read about her, they remembered her. They felt her story like a wound that refused to close. But Edward's reign, though transformative, was brief. When he died young in 1553, England was thrust into turmoil once more. His elder sister, Mary I, a devout Catholic determined to restore the old faith, ascended the throne. And with her came fire, more fire than England had ever seen. Mary revived the heresy laws and burned hundreds of Protestants at the stake. Men and women alike perished in flames across the kingdom. And yet, even in that dark and terrifying period, Anne Askew's memory refused to fade. Protestants who were arrested, who faced execution, who felt the heat rising beneath their feet, were told of Anne's courage. Her story became a whisper passed between prisoners, a steadying hand placed upon trembling hearts. She endured, so shall we. For them, Anne was not simply a martyr. She was a predecessor, someone who had gone ahead into the fire, proving that faith could survive even when the body could not. Then Mary died, and the crown passed to Elizabeth I in 1558. With Elizabeth came a new order, neither purely Catholic nor fully radical Protestant, but undeniably shaped by the reformist legacy. Under her long reign, England's identity tilted decisively toward Protestantism. And in the stories that defined that identity, Anne Askew's voice echoed clearly. Her martyrdom became part of England's Protestant mythology. Not myth as in fiction, but myth as in shared memory, the kind that guides a nation's soul. She became proof that England's new faith had been paid for with suffering, with flame, with the courage of ordinary believers. In the narrative of a country forging its religious identity, Anne stood like a small but unwavering star, lighting a path through blood and smoke. And here lies the quiet irony. If Henry VIII had meant to erase her, to scatter her existence into ash and wind, his daughter undid his intention entirely. Under Elizabeth, Anne Askew became not a forgotten rebel, but a symbol woven into the very identity of the realm. She was no queen. She held no title. She commanded no army. Yet through fire, she became one of the women who shaped an era. A gentlewoman meant to be forgotten by force, instead became a light that helped lead England into a new age and a reminder that sometimes the smallest voice survives the loudest flames. Among all the details recorded about Anne Askew, one stands apart: quiet, astonishing, and almost miraculous in its survival. Before her execution, before the flames of the 16th day of July in the year 1546, before her name became a whispered symbol of resistance, Anne herself wrote her story. Not a biography shaped by others, not a retelling framed by those who pitied her, but her own voice, sharp, precise, and unshaken. While imprisoned, she recorded her interrogations, her exchanges with counsellors, her arguments about doctrine, and her reflections on faith. These writings, later known as the Examinations, were crafted in a tone that startled even sympathetic readers, calm, analytical, almost icy in their clarity. Her body may have been wrecked by the rack, but her mind remained untouched, firm as ever. And in those pages, she revealed a spirit that torture could not distort. After her death, those precious manuscripts should have vanished into the dark machinery of the state. Yet through secretive hands, friends, sympathizers, perhaps even those within the tower who felt compassion, Anne's writings slipped past the walls designed to contain them. They surfaced first in the work of John Bale, an exiled Protestant scholar, and later were woven into the monumental text of John Foxe's Acts and Monuments, the great martyrology of the English Reformation. Thus, Anne became one of the first women in English history to leave behind a theological testimony in her own voice. When later generations opened those pages, they did not find despair. They found a mind operating with unnerving steadiness. Anne dissected theological claims, questioned tradition, and answered accusations with a logic so pointed that even her interrogators appeared small beside her words. And reading them, it becomes painfully clear. This was not a woman broken by fear. This was a woman who saw faith as something that could not be coerced, not by crown, not by clergy, not by fire. Her prose was not emotional. It was controlled. Her tone was not pleading. It was confident. Every sentence carried the quiet force of someone who had already decided what she was willing to die for. This intellectual strength made her martyrdom even more powerful. She did not go to the stake as someone overwhelmed by forces greater than herself. When later generations opened those pages, they did not find despair. They found a mind operating with unnerving steadiness. Anne dissected theological claims, questioned tradition, and answered accusations with a logic so pointed that even her interrogators appeared small beside her words. And reading them, it becomes painfully clear. This was not a woman broken by fear. This was a woman who saw faith as something that could not be coerced, not by crown, not by clergy, not by fire. Through Foxe's work, Anne ceased to be merely a symbol. She became a presence, a witness, a person whose thoughts breathed across the page as if she were still alive. In Elizabethan England, she became woven into the spiritual identity of the kingdom. She was not simply remembered, she was consulted. Her name appeared in sermons, in family readings, in theological debate. Children grew up hearing her story. Scholars referenced her arguments. Women took inspiration from her defiance. In some circles, her name was spoken alongside Jeanne d'Arc, another young woman who faced fire rather than deny what she believed to be true. Both had died young. Both had faced male authorities determined to silence them. Both became icons of conviction that no flame could extinguish. And here lies the profound irony at the heart of Anne Askew's legacy. Henry VIII's government had tried to erase her through fire, tried to swallow her body in flames so thoroughly that nothing remained to bury, nothing left to honor. But fire, which destroys so much, could not destroy her words. And those words traveled farther than any official proclamation, farther than any royal decree. What the authorities meant to silence became louder. What they meant to bury became immortal. What they meant to be an ending became a beginning. Anne Askew, the gentlewoman they tried to burn out of history, instead became a voice that slipped through the cracks of power and took root in the memory of a nation. There is something quietly extraordinary about the story of Anne Askew. Extraordinary precisely because she possessed none of the things that usually carve a person's name into history. She was not a great noblewoman, with alliances stretching across the kingdom. She commanded no armies, owned no estates, held no titles. She did not lead an uprising, did not stand at the head of a movement, and did not belong to a dynasty that could shield her from the dangers of speaking too boldly. And yet, across the long stretch of English memory, her name endures more vividly than many who once wielded real political power. Historians have long puzzled over this paradox. How did a young gentlewoman who appeared on the stage of public life for only a brief span, who left behind no heirs, no monuments, and no grand lineage come to be remembered as one of the defining religious figures of the Tudor age? The answer may lie in the powerful contrast that shaped her life. A fragile body set against a colossal state, a lone woman facing an entire legal and ecclesiastical system, a person without earthly power, armed only with conviction. In the 16th century, belief was not a private affair. To question doctrine was to question the crown itself. The England of Henry VIII was a place where religion and politics intertwined so tightly that even a whisper could be judged subversive. And yet Anne insisted on reading the Bible for herself, an act that placed her in direct collision with a political world she never sought to enter. She did not intend to become a martyr. She did not seek drama or confrontation. She simply refused to pretend belief in what she did not find in Scripture. But in a kingdom where kings had torn church and state apart with a signature, her honesty became dangerous. To the government, Anne was a threat, a potential spark in a realm full of dry kindling. But to the people, she became something else entirely, a reminder that truth is not measured by status, and that conviction can outlast cruelty. When she refused to name those in the court who shared reformist sympathies, when she protected not only the humble but those at the heart of the palace, her silence became louder than any confession. The fact that she would not betray Catherine Parr, despite unbearable torture, transformed her from a mere suspect into a figure of startling moral clarity. Her interrogators had wanted names. Instead, they encountered character. And on the day she was carried to Smithfield, strapped to a chair because the rack had destroyed her limbs, that clarity became visible to all. Her voice, rising above the crackle of the pyre, did what no royal proclamation ever could. It pierced the cold machinery of fear. She had no sword, no soldiers, only scripture on her tongue. Yet the moment she began to speak, the narrative the authorities hoped to stage slipped out of their hands. That is the paradox at the heart of her legacy. A woman reduced to physical ruin became, in her final moments, a figure of terrifying strength. And because of that strength, Anne Askew did not sink into the long list of Tudor victims, those who died and disappeared. Instead, she became a chapter in the very story of England's religious identity. Not a footnote, not a cautionary tale, but a cornerstone of Protestant memory. Her life shows that influence does not always come from position. Sometimes it comes from the refusal to bend, from the quiet courage of remaining faithful when faith becomes costly. And in an age when kings and bishops sought to command belief by force, it was Anne, a young woman with no worldly power, who revealed how fragile such force could be when matched against a conscience that would not yield. That is why history remembers her. That is why her name still burns, long after the flames of Smithfield faded into ash. On the day Anne Askew died, the intention of the Tudor government was painfully transparent: to use fire as a warning, to scorch fear so deeply into the minds of Londoners that even the faintest whisper of reform would make them tremble. Smithfield was meant to be a stage on which obedience triumphed and dissent was reduced to ash. But history obeys no government, no council, no sheriff holding a torch. And in the years that followed, England spiraled through wave after wave of religious whiplash, Catholic and Protestant rulers rising and falling, each leaving behind their own trail of gallows, pyres, and execution blocks. Yet through all this turbulence, the memory of Anne Askew refused to vanish. It clung to England like smoke long after the fire was gone. It lingered in sermons, in secret gatherings, in the cautious conversations of those who feared the wrong ears might be listening. Indeed, the memory was too vivid, too human, too searingly unforgettable to be erased. Over time, through the reigns of Edward VI, Mary I, and then Elizabeth I, people began to see Anne's death not merely as the tragedy of one young woman, but as a mirror reflecting the very crisis the kingdom was undergoing. Her execution revealed the cracks in the old order, the rising power of new ideas, and the desperate anxiety of those who ruled. She embodied the collision between the waning authority of traditional religion and the unstoppable momentum of a faith grounded in personal conviction rather than royal decree. And when England finally settled tentatively, imperfectly into a Protestant identity during the reign of Elizabeth I, the stories of martyrs like Anne Askew became the emotional architecture of the new era. They were retold from pulpits, studied in households, shared in books that travelled from town to town. They were proof, people said, that the new faith had been purchased not by Parliament alone, but by suffering, by bodies broken on racks, by voices reciting scripture over the roar of flames. What is astonishing is the nature of Anne's victory. She did not triumph during her lifetime. She was not acquitted, not rescued, not pardoned. She was not granted mercy or honoured with a proper burial. There is no grave where admirers can lay flowers. No carved stone bears her name. No church claims her as its patron. And yet, she is remembered. Her story lived because it was carried from mouth to mouth, page to page, heart to heart, long after the authorities believed they had extinguished her influence. The fire that consumed her body somehow preserved her spirit, as if the flames themselves became unwilling custodians of the truth they were meant to erase. In this strange irony lies the power of her legacy. Anne Askew won nothing the world measures. No title. Many historians believe this transformation had an emotional foundation laid not by kings nor bishops, but by martyrs. And among them, none shone brighter nor more painfully than Anne Askew. Her story had moved through England like a quiet earthquake. The brutality she endured, the way her crippled body was carried to Smithfield, the scripture she read as fire rose around her, it shaped how ordinary people felt about faith. Why did she haunt them? Why does she haunt us still? Perhaps because Anne Askew forced the Tudor world to confront a truth it did not want to acknowledge, that ideas cannot be executed. That the human conscience, when anchored in conviction rather than fear, can withstand even the most brutal machinery of the state. That the strength of a belief is not measured by its popularity, but by the courage it inspires when placed under pressure. And perhaps most of all, Anne Askew became a reminder, an uncomfortable one, that power built on coercion is fragile. That the rack could twist bones, but not the mind. That fire could destroy flesh, but not faith. That laws can be rewritten, but conscience cannot. In the end, the most unsettling question her story leaves behind is simple. How could a woman physically broken make the powerful tremble? The answer is just as simple and just as timeless. Because truth spoken by someone with nothing to lose becomes indestructible. Anne Askew left behind no dynasty, no wealth, no structure of influence. But she left behind something even kings and queens struggle to achieve: a story that outlives its own century, that refuses to fade, that continues to whisper across the ages. A story that fire could not silence.